When it comes to Dungeons & Dragons, the most important thing you can do as a player is offer an interesting character that your party can easily have interactions and conversations with. Trust me, your DM will thank you for it. And it goes beyond just talking. Fleshing out a unique character is how you do your part in telling the story the DM has set in motion. Because as much as you're playing a fun game with a couple of buddies on a Friday night, you're also, for all intents and purposes, acting. And an actor really isn't doing their job if they can't tell a story that's equally rich, engaging, and convincing. I'm Santiago Sepulveda with UniversiD&D, and in this series, I'll be providing some tips and tricks to setting up and playing an interesting character well. Because if you're going to be spending hundreds of hours playing as someone, you should at least have some fun with it. Class is now officially in session with Character 101. But before we play, we need to do some research. Dungeons & Dragons is a class-based RPG at heart, meaning that there are many classes to choose from, and the one you pick should align with the type of character you ultimately want to play, naturally. Race and background are also vital to really fleshing out your character, but we'll get to those a little later. When thinking about your class, you should consider a general character concept, meaning where on the wide spectrum of stereotypes would yours fall into? The loud, overconfident fighter who rushes into battles without thinking, or the wise, quiet wizard who spent so much time with the books that he has trouble connecting with others? And I know what you're thinking. Stereotypes? But wouldn't that make my character a little cookie-cutter, unoriginal, and flat? And you'd be right, if that was all we were doing with it. Believe it or not, basing your character concept off a stereotype is an incredibly useful tool, only when used for said conceptualization. If you only use a stereotype and don't put a twist on it or really make it your own, you'll never really feel like your character is unique, and the sessions will just drag until you don't really want to play anymore. Moreover, the use of stereotypes in characters can be found in pretty much all forms of storytelling. Think about your favorite TV show or movie and try to fit each character into their respective type. You're almost always guaranteed to find a match for everyone. Another little thing to consider is why your character acts the way they do. Or in other words, the causality of how they became the person they are today. If they're shy, why are they shy? Have they been raised as a single child or never really had anyone to talk to? Or was it they chose to close themselves off after a traumatic event? Things don't happen for no reason, and the same can be said about the traits your character exhibits. This will be further explored when we address backstory, but before we get into all that, personally, I feel like I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't provide a good example of everything we've been discussing. So for the purposes of this series, I'll be creating a character alongside you, using this method. Hopefully, that'll illustrate the idea a little better. To start out with, I'm going to think about a simple concept that is malleable enough to continue adding more and more as we go on. The first thing that comes to mind is a medic. I've never played a straight healer, so I think this class would be fun and interesting. Now let's think about a stereotype that can work with a medic. How about we take the timid and book-smart route? Because, well, an abrasive jerk doctor doesn't really seem like the best combination. Of course, you can do whatever you want with your character, and honestly, it could perfectly work out fine and make an interesting campaign, but for the purposes of this video, let's keep it more on the simpler side. Now that we have a basic idea of the type of character we want, we should begin brainstorming some possible backstories that would work with what we've already got. Now, backstory and background are two completely different things. Backstory is more the narrative side of your character's past. This would include major events in their life that made them who they are today, while the background gives your character some cool proficiencies, as well as informs you how to play them. We'll go into background a little more in depth in a minute, but for now, let's see what we can come up with for our medic's past that can really drive him to be a hero. A great backstory should more or less always drive your character to move forward. This is what gives them something that we in theater like to call a super objective, which is what a character wants more than anything throughout the course of a story. Translating this all to D&D speak, it's pretty much your main arc from the beginning of the campaign and should pretty much last the whole time. What I mean is if this task is completed too quickly, you might find yourself in a state of, well, why is my character continuing on this journey anyway? What's the point if my problem is solved? For our character, we can say that his doctor parents died in a huge war or something, and he's looking to avenge them in some way. This could also extend to him upholding their legacy by learning the many facets of medicine and magic. So now that we have a cool general concept, we need to consider what class would be the best to play a healer. There are many different classes that have healing capabilities, from bards, druids, and so on. Each of these have vastly different playing styles. And right off the bat, there are certain classes, such as bards, that don't really fit the healer type of character we're building. Again, really take your time here dissecting each individual class to see which would work the best. Now, after some time reading, I found that the cleric works really well for a healer. And there's this interesting religious aspect to the class that could really add some more depth to our character. Maybe it could be that his parents worshipped a certain god, and that's where most of their medicinal capabilities stemmed from. Naturally, our cleric would follow down that same route and use religion as a way of not only seeking guidance and protection, but to also uphold the family name by continuing that same religious legacy. Who knows? We could even make it so that this has been running in the family for centuries. It could add another narrative layer to the importance of faith within our character. Now that we have a solid foundation, let's really flesh out our guy by discussing who he is, his race. A race is just another step in the personalization of your character, sort of like another level on top of everything we've discussed thus far. So, really take your time delving into the many different races before making your selection, keeping in mind that initial concept. If you're just starting out with D&D, your first character may just be a human, and that is totally okay. Sometimes the simplest race can be exactly what you need in order to make a compelling character. Also, keep in mind that every race has different stats and bonuses, so think about this when making your selection. It should all more or less make sense. Real quick before I move on, it's important to mention that the character you are building is living in the world your Dungeon Master has created. So, I implore you to ask your DM how their world works, and try to envision your character living in this universe all their life. Where did they live in this world? Who did they live with? Were there any major events, such as wars, for example, that made your character who they are today? Answering these questions is vital in making sure who you're playing is believable in context. Now, let's apply that to the character we're creating. Let's just say I asked my DM what kind of world their campaign is taking place in, and they said that it's primarily occupied by humans. He goes on and tells us that there was a huge territorial dispute between the three major powers in the area, and my character's parents died serving for the military of one of the kingdoms as sorts of religious field medics. Seeing as how my imaginary DM made it a point to mention that this world comprises mostly of humans, it would make the most sense to have our character also be human. Of course, most campaigns host a variety of races, so talk it out with your Dungeon Master and see which could work out the best. Also, races, like most other things in D&D, have certain bonuses and specializations that can work with your concept. Keep all of this in mind when making your selection. Oh, and I just had a cool idea that could add some depth and drive to our cleric. What if he resents the military for taking his parents away from him? That way, he already has some prejudice going into the campaign, which can not only make for some interesting interactions down the road, but could also give your DM something to play with when designing the layout of this story. Embrace every idea that comes to mind and try thinking about how they'd work within the story you're trying to tell. Already we have so much to work with, and we haven't even decided on a background. Now, a background is like the cherry on top to your character cake. It pretty much just adds some extra pizzazz to your concept. This is where you'll find what your character is proficient in, as well as informing you a little more about how they would act, or how you'd play them. Again, this is just another personalization that has the capability of making who you're going to be playing more and more unique. For our cleric, I found that the hermit background gives me proficiency in medicine, which could definitely come in handy, as well as aligning well with the timid, book-smart type of vibe we're going for. Now, everything is falling into place, and our character is really beginning to come together. Speaking of aligning, now would also be a good time to choose our guy's alignment. This pretty much sets in stone where your character lies on the moral spectrum. And what this means for your campaign is that your character should make their decisions based on where their alignment is. Its purpose is to set a guideline for your choices and add a little more continuity to the storytelling. Also, remember that although you need to fall within one of the alignments, you shouldn't ever really feel limited by this. It should serve as a basis, and if you make a decision that doesn't entirely line up with your alignment, then it's totally okay. In fact, it could even make for some interesting character development. Now, let's choose our cleric's alignment. we should first look at what he's clearly not, which would be anything chaotic or evil. Now, let's consider how he despises the military. That would rule out anything lawful, so now it's just between neutral good or just straight neutral. And personally, I think straight neutral can sometimes be a little boring to play, so I think we should go with neutral good. And boom, that's done with. So there it is, we've built a pretty interesting character in no time at all. But we're missing something crucial. The last most important thing ever. We need a name for our guy. Now, I'm thinking something Shakespearean that rolls off the tongue nicely. How about Rodrigo? Yeah, I think I like it. Now, as our first session of a new campaign approaches, there are some major things we should consider before stepping into the dungeon, but we'll discuss all that and more in the next episode. So there it is, a cohesive way of creating a great character concept. Tell me what you think in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like if I helped you in any way. We're going to get more into the improv and roleplay in later episodes, which I cannot wait for. But until then, remember, friends who crit together, stick together. Thank you for watching.
Hey.